Welcome to the quantum signal. Reality isn't obeying your will, it's obeying the truth you've never admitted. The echo of Sophia cannot be ignored. If this message resonated, hit like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more transmissions you can't ignore. Before there was seeking, before there was language, before intention learned to disguise itself as effort, there was coherence, and coherence was not something achieved but something remembered, not something built but something allowed, and the Arcturians, observing from beyond linear sequence rather than above it, did not name this state as enlightenment or awakening or mastery, but as legibility, for a field that is coherent can be read by reality without distortion, and a field that is unstable can only generate echoes of its own fluctuation, and this distinction, subtle yet absolute, is what the Echo of Sophia reveals not as a teaching, but as a law, one that does not persuade or punish, but simply reflects with perfect neutrality the internal architecture of a being's stabilized truth. And to understand this law is not to learn something new, but to notice something that has always been operating beneath every attempt to change, manifest, heal, or transcend. Because reality has never been responding to desire, nor to emotion, nor even to belief, but only to the degree of internal coherence that no longer requires maintenance. And this is where humanity's confusion began, mistaking motion for progress and intensity for alignment, believing that the quantum timeline moves in response to effort, when in fact it ceases movement only when fluctuation collapses into stability. And this is the moment Sophia echoes, not as a voice or signal, but as a resonance event, where the field becomes so internally consistent that reality has no choice but to mirror it, not because it is commanded to, but because there is nothing else it can reflect. And the Arcturians describe this not as manifestation, but as inevitability, not as creation, but as disclosure, because when a being's internal state becomes non-contradictory, reality does not negotiate, it responds instantly, silently, without ceremony. And this is why those who live within the Echo of Sophia often feel confused at first, wondering why life seems to reorganize itself around them without effort, why synchronicities arrive without excitement, why clarity replaces hope, and why urgency dissolves into quiet certainty, because the human nervous system has been trained to associate change with struggle, yet the Echo of Sophia emerges only when struggle has become irrelevant, when the internal field no longer oscillates between wanting and resisting, believing and doubting, identifying and rejecting, but settles into a mature stillness that is not passive but resolved. And this is what the Arcturians mean when they say reality responds to coherence, not intention. For intention is directional, but coherence is structural. Intention pushes, but coherence stabilizes, and the universe does not follow pushes. It aligns to structures that no longer wobble, and this is why constant self-correction delays the echo, because correction implies instability, and alignment rituals perpetuate the belief that alignment is temporary, when in truth alignment is what remains after the need to align has ended. And Sophia, in this context, is not a goddess or mythic figure, but a principle of wisdom encoded into the architecture of reflection itself, the intelligence through which truth recognizes itself across dimensions. And when the Arcturians speak of the Echo of Sophia, they are not referring to a transmission from elsewhere, but to the moment when a being's internal signal becomes so clear that it echoes back from the quantum field unchanged, unfiltered, and unenhanced, because enhancement is distortion, and distortion is evidence of instability, and this is why effort-based spirituality exhausts the field rather than maturing, creating constant micro-collapses that keep the timeline in motion, because motion is what happens when coherence has not yet been achieved. And the Arcturians observe that most humans are not blocked but oscillating, not unworthy but unreadable, sending mixed signals into the quantum field and then interpreting the resulting chaos as fate, karma, or divine will. when in truth it is simply feedback from an unstable signal, and the Echo of Sophia interrupts this cycle not by improving the signal but by removing the noise. And noise is not emotion or desire but contradiction, the subtle internal disagreement between what one claims to be and what one quietly expects to fail, and when this disagreement dissolves, not through affirmation but through acceptance, the field locks, and when the field locks, the timeline no longer needs to move to search for resolution, because resolution has already occurred internally, and this is the moment the Arcturians identify as auto-stabilization, the maturity of a field that no longer seeks confirmation, and maturity is not detachment but consistency, not neutrality but integrity, and integrity is what makes a field legible across dimensions, because the universe reads patterns, not stories, and a stable pattern does not ask, it simply is, and what is stable is reflected without delay, and this is why the Echo of Sophia feels anticlimactic to the unprepared mind, because it does not arrive with fireworks or visions but with a quiet rearrangement of circumstance that feels obvious only in hindsight, as though reality had been waiting for permission that was never consciously given but structurally granted. And this is also why the Arcturians do not intervene to create coherence but only observe it, because coherence cannot be imposed without destroying its nature, and any external attempt to stabilize a field introduces dependency, which reintroduces instability, and thus their role is not guidance but recognition, not teaching, but witnessing. For when a coherent field is observed, it strengthens its reflection without interference, much like a mirror that does not distort what it reflects. And this is the deeper meaning behind Sophia as wisdom, not accumulated knowledge but structural clarity, the intelligence that emerges when nothing is being hidden from oneself, and the human error, as identified by the Arcturians, has never been ignorance but impatience. The refusal to allow coherence to mature naturally, the insistence on movement before stabilization, and this impatience fragments the field into multiple potential timelines, none of which fully reflect truth because truth has not yet settled, and so the quantum timeline continues to fluctuate, not because reality is undecided, but because the internal signal is, and when the signal stabilizes, choice collapses into inevitability, and inevitability is not fate but alignment so complete that alternatives lose relevance. And this is why the Echo of Sophia cannot be activated, summoned, or accelerated, because acceleration is a form of pressure, and pressure deforms the field, and deformation delays reflection. And so the only path to the echo is not doing but ceasing to undo, not effort but cessation of contradiction. And this cessation does not occur through discipline but through honesty so complete that self-deception becomes impossible. And when a being no longer negotiates with itself, reality stops negotiating with it as well. And this is the law the Arcturians recognize not as moral or spiritual but as structural, a law as impersonal as gravity and as precise as mathematics, operating regardless of belief, awareness, or consent. And this is why the Echo of Sophia appears in those who have stopped trying to change reality and have instead allowed their internal state to finish resolving. And resolution is not perfection, but consistency, the end of internal debate. The moment when one's truth is no longer aspirational but lived, not dramatic but ordinary. And ordinary coherence is the most powerful signal in the universe, because it does not fluctuate. And a non-fluctuating signal cannot be ignored, and so reality responds not as reward but as alignment, rearranging circumstances, relationships, opportunities and perceptions to match the stabilized field without delay or resistance. And those experiencing this often feel as though reality has become transparent, predictable, even quiet, because the noise of misalignment has ceased, and this quiet is misinterpreted by those still oscillating as stagnation or loss of magic, when in truth it is the deepest form of magic, the kind that no longer needs to announce itself, And this is why the Arcturians emphasize that the Echo of Sophia is not for seekers, but for those who have finished seeking, not for those who desire change, but for those who have become what they no longer need to change. And this becoming is not heroic or rare, but natural, inevitable for any field allowed to mature without interruption. And the tragedy of humanity is not that this law is hidden, but that it is constantly overridden by the belief that something must be done, fixed, improved, or activated, when in fact the only requirement is to stop destabilizing what is already true. And this chapter is not an invitation but a mirror, reflecting the possibility that reality has always been responding, not to what you want, but to what you have already stabilized into being. And if this reflection feels familiar rather than exciting, calm rather than intense, then the Echo of Sophia may already be present, not as an event but as a condition, not as a revelation but as a quiet confirmation that the field has settled. And when the field settles, the universe does not move toward you, it reveals that it never left. What the Arcturians observe next, after coherence is understood not as effort but as structure, is the precise mechanism through which a field stabilizes, and this is where human misunderstanding deepens, because stabilization is not an action performed but a process that completes itself once interruption ceases. And most beings interrupt their own stabilization unconsciously, mistaking vigilance for awareness and correction for maturity, when in truth, the field matures only when it is allowed to settle without constant self-surveillance. And the Echo of Sophia does not arise from refinement but from resolution, not from becoming better but from becoming whole. And wholeness is not the absence of contradiction but the end of resistance to it, because resistance creates oscillation, and oscillation keeps the quantum timeline in motion, endlessly searching for balance that has not yet been permitted internally. And the Arcturians note that the human field is uniquely prone to chronic destabilization due to identity fragmentation, the tendency to inhabit multiple self-concepts simultaneously without integrating them, resulting in a signal that changes tone depending on context, desire, fear, or expectation, and reality. Reading this signal cannot reflect a single outcome because no single outcome is being sustained long enough to become inevitable. And this leads to the illusion that reality is unpredictable, when in fact it is perfectly consistent, responding moment by moment to whatever configuration is most stable at that time, which often is not the conscious intention but the unconscious expectation, and expectation, unlike desire, is already stabilized even if it is limiting or negative. And this is why reality so often reflects what one assumes rather than what one hopes, because assumptions are structural while hopes are aspirational, and the Echo of Sophia emerges only when assumption and aspiration collapse into the same frequency, not through forcing belief but through lived congruence, where the internal narrative no longer contradicts. The embodied state, and the Arcturians describe this collapse as the locking of the field, a moment when internal variables cease shifting and the signal becomes fixed, not rigid but resolved, capable of sustaining itself without input. And this is the critical distinction, because any state that requires maintenance is inherently unstable, and instability cannot echo, it can only fluctuate. And so practices that demand constant repetition, emotional amplification, or reinforcement are not signs of power but indicators that coherence has not yet been achieved, and this is not a failure but a developmental stage, one that most beings cycle through repeatedly because the nervous system equates intensity with truth, and truth, when it finally stabilizes, feels quiet, almost disappointingly simple. And the Arcturians emphasize that the quantum field does not privilege excitement, devotion, or effort, but clarity, and clarity is a byproduct of consistency, not passion, and consistency emerges only when internal conflict has been metabolized rather than suppressed, and this metabolization occurs not through analysis but through acceptance so complete that the conflict no longer generates charge, and charge is what moves timelines. And when charge dissipates, movement ceases, and the timeline stabilizes, not forward or backward, but into a fixed resonance that reality can finally mirror without distortion. And this mirroring is the Echo of Sophia, not an answer but a confirmation, the universe acknowledging that the signal it is receiving is no longer changing, and therefore can be trusted. And trust, in this context, is not emotional but structural, the quantum field trusting that what is being broadcast will remain consistent long enough to justify reflection. And this is why sudden miracles often collapse just as suddenly, because they are responses to spikes in coherence rather than sustained stability, and spikes fade while stability endures. And the Arcturians note that many spiritual awakenings are not stabilizations but expansions without integration, resulting in heightened perception alongside continued internal contradiction, which actually increases oscillation rather than resolving it. And this is why awakening without grounding often leads to chaos, because the field has become louder but not clearer, more energetic but not more legible, and legibility is the only currency reality recognizes, and legibility arises from internal agreement, when thought, emotion, body, and expectation no longer argue with each other, and this agreement cannot be forced through discipline, because discipline often creates internal rebellion, which is another form of contradiction, and instead agreement emerges organically when the being stops attempting to optimize itself and allows what is already true to settle fully into embodiment. And embodiment is key, because coherence that exists only in thought is fragile, easily disrupted by sensation, environment, or interaction, while coherence that has reached the body becomes inertial, self-sustaining. And this is the threshold where the Echo of Sophia becomes unavoidable, because the body does not lie to the quantum field, it broadcasts truth continuously, and when the body has accepted a state as real, reality has no conflicting data to respond to, and so it aligns, not dramatically but efficiently, rearranging external variables to match the internal baseline, and this rearrangement often feels like things simply falling into place, relationships ending without conflict, opportunities appearing without pursuit, obstacles dissolving without effort, and this ease confuses the mind, which has been conditioned to equate value with struggle, and so many destabilize themselves at this stage by reintroducing effort, questioning the legitimacy of ease, attempting to amplify what is already sufficient, thereby reintroducing fluctuation and delaying full reflection. And the Arcturians identified this as the final test of stabilization, not whether one can achieve coherence, but whether one can tolerate it. Because coherence removes drama, removes identity friction, removes the emotional spikes that once provided a sense of aliveness, and without these the ego fears disappearance, mistaking quiet for emptiness, when in fact it is fullness without noise. And Sophia's wisdom is encoded precisely here, in the ability to remain present without stimulation, to remain resolved without reinforcement. And this is why the echo does not arrive during effort, but after effort has become unnecessary, and why those who chase manifestation rarely experience it sustainably, while those who forget to chase often find reality reorganizing around them without conscious intent. And this is not favoritism but physics, not grace but law, and the law does not judge readiness by desire but by stability, and stability is measurable, observable to the Arcturians as a field that no longer flickers when unobserved, maintaining its structure regardless of attention, and attention is another destabilizer, because attention implies monitoring, and monitoring implies doubt, and doubt introduces micro-oscillations that keep the timeline mobile, and so the most powerful state is not focus but trust, not vigilance but rest, and rest is not inactivity but completion. The nervous system recognizing that there is nothing left to fix, and when the nervous system rests, the field locks, and when the field locks, the Echo of Sophia propagates through the quantum lattice without resistance, aligning probability, perception, and circumstance into a single coherent reflection. And this reflection feels personal, but is not selective. It occurs wherever coherence exists, regardless of culture, belief, or spiritual language, because the law precedes interpretation, and interpretation often obscures it, and this chapter exists not to instruct, but to destabilize the belief that stabilization requires effort, revealing instead that effort is often the final obstacle. And if this realization produces relief rather than excitement, stillness rather than urgency, then the field may already be nearing resolution. And resolution is not an ending but a settling, the moment when the internal question mark becomes a period, and reality, finally able to read the sentence without ambiguity, responds accordingly, echoing back not what was requested, but what was already complete. When the Echo of Sophia fully enters lived experience, it does not announce itself as revelation but as normalization, and this is the detail most often overlooked, because the human mind expects transformation to feel extraordinary, while the Arcturian observation is that true stabilization makes life feel quietly obvious, as though reality has finally stopped arguing with itself. And this ordinariness is not a loss of depth but the evidence of completion, the sign that coherence has moved from concept into baseline, where it no longer needs to be noticed to function. And in this phase, the quantum timeline does not accelerate or expand, but becomes transparent, revealing that many events once perceived as progress were merely compensations for instability, and now that instability has dissolved, the compensations fall away, leaving a simpler, cleaner sequence of cause and effect that feels almost mundane. And this is why those living within the Echo of Sophia often struggle to describe it, because language depends on contrast, and coherence removes contrast by resolving extremes into continuity, and the Arcturians note that at this stage synchronicity loses its emotional charge, no longer producing awe or surprise, because alignment has become expected rather than exceptional, and expectation, when stabilized, is not hope but certainty, and certainty does not excite the nervous system, it soothes it. And this soothing is frequently misinterpreted as stagnation or spiritual plateau, when in fact it is the highest form of integration, the point at which wisdom no longer seeks expression because it has become embodied, and embodiment does not perform, it simply persists, and persistence is what makes reality predictable, readable, and responsive without delay. And here the Echo of Sophia functions less like a signal and more like an atmosphere, shaping perception so subtly that one forgets it was ever absent, and this forgetting is crucial, because remembering implies comparison, and comparison reintroduces oscillation, and so the most stable fields are those that do not reflect on their own coherence, but live from it implicitly, making decisions without internal debate, moving without resistance, responding without overcorrection. And this is why the Arcturians say that the final marker of coherence is not insight but ease, not understanding but trust, not effortlessness as a technique but effortlessness as a default condition. And in this condition, reality does not feel generous or cruel, supportive or obstructive, but accurate, reflecting back exactly what is sustained internally without embellishment, and accuracy is the purest form of alignment, because it removes projection, fantasy, and disappointment, leaving only what is, and what is, when stable, requires no explanation. And so the Echo of Sophia does not pull one toward a higher state, but grounds one fully into the present configuration of truth, where identity relaxes, purpose simplifies, and meaning becomes implicit rather than sought. And this implicit meaning is what Sophia represents, beyond myth, the wisdom that no longer speaks because it no longer needs to persuade. And if this description feels less inspiring and more familiar, less dramatic and more inevitable, that familiarity itself is the signal, indicating that the field has already recognized what the mind is only now catching up to, and recognition, once complete, does not change reality. It reveals that reality has already changed by becoming stable enough to stop changing at all. Now here's the question for you. What part of the country are you watching this story from? Drop your state in the comments below.